Hello. I'd like to welcome all of you, those present actually and those present virtually, to this conversation held at the NYU Abu Dhabi site on Washington Square. My name is Jacques Lezra. I'm the chair of the Comparative Literature Department at NYU, and I'm helping to organize the set of talks held here this year on the global topic of the cosmopolitan idea. This evening's discussion takes as its focus the question of cosmopolitanism and translation. And the ground we will be tilling in order to come at the question is the ground of literature, a sort of third term between and amid the terms cosmopolitanism and translation. We have two very distinguished guests who will be in conversation on this topic, Professor David Damrosch of Harvard University, and Tahar Ben Jelloun, the poet, essayist, and novelist based in Paris. I'm also delighted to acknowledge the assistance of Isabelle Dupuis, who will be providing simultaneous translation for Tahar Ben Jelloun. I will, with your permission, first introduce our topic and then introduce our two discussants. The words cosmopolitanism and translation make an odd sort of couple, for a number of reasons. The least important of these reasons is that the words come from two different linguistic traditions. A Greek world, where the cosmos and the polis, the world and the city, were imagined in ways connected to the ancient political economy and are only applied by extension today. And then on the other side, a Latin world in which translaciones were not just movements between languages, but also movements of peoples, goods, relics, and so on within the Roman Empire and among the peoples of that empire. Today, the oddity of the coupling of cosmopolitanism and translation comes from a different source than the oddity of coupling the Greek and Roman traditions. A cosmopolitan person would seem to be someone who is at ease in different cultures, not so much because she or he requires that the different cultures be translated for him or for her, but precisely because she or he is above mere translation. The cosmopolitan moves among worlds, from one linguistic environment to another, and doesn't need a translator. The cosmopolitan is himself a principle of translatability, translated from one place or culture to another, but only because for the cosmopolitan, the governing language is the all-embracing language of the world, of the cosmos. Possessing the world, the cosmopolitan needs no translation for the languages that make up that world. The cosmopolitan speaks tendentially all the languages of the cosmos. Alongside the cosmopolitan idea and the idea of the cosmopolitan world inhabitant, however, we find at work today the principle of translation and of translatability, and the idea of the world-roaming monoglot national who requires that all languages be translatable into his. On this description, no language is so particular that it cannot, for certain practical purposes or others, be translated into another one. This principle of translatability thus acknowledges the particularities of national languages and linguistic environments, while at the same time assuming that they can, for certain purposes, be mapped onto one another or made transferable, transportable into other languages or into a single language. The political economic implications of the idea of universal translation are as far-reaching as they are obvious. The global market requires, is based upon, and in turn facilitates a global flow of translation so that my product's values are understandable beyond the local environment in which they are produced or the local markets where they were first designed to fit a consumer's needs. They don't need to be the same, just understandable. Today, the principle of translation and of translatability is so firmly braided with the principle of global economic mobility that the two cannot be disentangled from each other. But literature has an oblique relation both to the idea that there is a unitary world inhabited by cosmopolitan souls and to the idea that the use of language is primarily a pragmatic matter. In one of Tahar Ben Jelloun's best-known novels, a character appears late in the novel. He is a blind minstrel, le troubadour aveugle, the ancestral figure of literature, song, and culture. He describes himself in a way that allows us also to see how Tahar Ben Jelloun is imagining literature itself. Je viens de loin, says this Homeric figure, d'un autre siècle, versé dans un conte par un autre conte, et votre histoire, parce qu'elle n'est plus une traduction de la réalité, m'intéresse. I come from afar, from another century, poured out into one story by another story, and your history, inasmuch as it is not a translation of reality, interests me. Literature, this blind principle that is decanted, versé, with a wonderful oral pun on the English word, or the French word, verse. So you'd have almost to say, untranslatably, that literature is versed from one story into another. Literature, a principle versed from one story into another, over time has no interest in the mere translation of reality. So, can literature be translated? Is literature the province of the cosmopolitan alone? The answer to these sorts of questions is unhelpfully both yes and no. No, literature is not translatable. It's what remains after you've done a pragmatic translation of this or that bit of writing. Literature is the residue of pragmatic translation. It translates a word like Ben Jelloun's verser into the English pour, or decant, or transmit, or translate. But yes, literature is translated every day, as are the works of Tahar Ben Jelloun, for instance. There is a global market in the translations of works of literature. We understand that verser means to pour or spill, and we move on in reading L'Enfant de Sable. And no, literature is not the province of the cosmopolitan alone. Literature does not depend on the idea that we share a world, that we inhabit a common notional city where mere languages like Spanish, English, or French, as Jorge Luis Borges once wrote, will disappear. But yes, literature, the concept of literature, and indeed the value that drives the economics of translation, is to some extent dependent on a universal notion, on a notion of the universality and of the universal value of culture that we derive from the Enlightenment, and specifically from the work of Immanuel Kant. So what is it that literature does translate, or verser, from one place and century and story into another? We find both this uncomfortable yes and no movement and a possible answer to that last question, the question of what literature translates today, at the heart of David Damrosch's recent description of world literature. Reading a work from a distant time or place, writes Damrosch in How to Read World Literature, involves a back and forth movement between the familiar and the unfamiliar. A view of the world is always a view from wherever the observer is standing, and we inevitably filter what we read through our experience of what we have read in the past. Damrosch continues, but then, if we don't simply overlay our prior expectations wholesale onto the new work, its distinctive qualities will impress themselves on us, enlarging our field of vision and giving us a new purchase on the things we knew before. This is, of course, a very big if, but the project that it announces is crucial. It is nothing less than the project of understanding how a particular view of the world can be translated into a view of a shared world, and of understanding how literature can serve to mediate the shared world's view or construction or management of the familiar world. Cosmopolitanism and translation meet today where the familiar world of our lived experiences, readings, and environments is made unfamiliar by the shared world, where the world or the cosmos that we share is made familiar by the particular worlds and languages that we do not share. It is my hope that today's conversation between David Damrosch and Tahar Ben Jelloun, which I will have the pleasure of moderating and participating in a bit, will allow us to understand better that strange and paradoxical project. And now for the introductions. David Damrosch is professor of comparative literature and chair of the Department of Comparative Literature at Harvard University. Professor Damrosch received his BA in 1975 and his PhD in 1980 from the Department of Comparative Literature at Yale University, my own alma mater, as we say. He taught at Columbia University from 1980 until 2009 and served as chair of the Department of English and Comparative Literature there from 1996 to 1999. From 2001 to 2003, Professor Damrosch was president of the American Comparative Literature Association. David Damrosch has written widely on comparative and world literature. His books include The Narrative Covenant, Transformations of Genre in the Growth of Biblical Literature, We Scholars, Changing the Culture of the University, What is World Literature, The Buried Book, The Loss and Rediscovery of the Great Epic of Gilgamesh, and How to Read World Literature, from which I quoted a moment ago. He is the founding general editor of the 6-volume Longman Anthology of World Literature and of the 6-volume Longman Anthology of British Literature, editor of Teaching World Literature, a co-editor of the Princeton Sourcebook in Comparative Literature, and co-editor of a recent collection whose title is in Chinese, so I won't try it, from Beijing University Press in 2010. He served as the principal literary advisor for Invitation to World Literature, a 13-part series airing on public television in fall 2010. David Damrosch is currently writing a book called Comparing the Literatures, What Every Comparatist Needs to Know. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Tahar Ben Jelloun. Je ne me suis jamais battu, says Tahar Ben Jelloun. I've never fought or I've never been in a fight. These are the first words of the narrative of Ben Jelloun's 1982-1983 novel, L'écrivain public. They're perhaps literally true of the narrator, who witnesses any number of fights himself, as the novel recounts, erotic battles as well as literal invasions, but Tahar Ben Jelloun, the writer, Tahar Ben Jelloun, the écrivain public, has been engaged in urgent battles from his earliest days as a young man studying first at the Lycée Français Regnault in Tangiers, then a graduate student of philosophy at the Université Mohammed V in Rabat, as a member of the Souffle journal collective founded by Abdelatif Lahabi, and then when Souffle was shut by the government, of the journal Intégral, which retained the radical edge of Souffle and directed it explicitly toward the fields of the plastic and literary arts. In 1966, suspected of helping to organize the student revolts that year, Ben Jelloun was sent to a detention and discipline camp in which he spent 18 months or so before being set free in 1968. Ben Jelloun emigrated to France in 1971, the year that also saw the publication of his first work, a collection of poems titled Homme sous linceul de silence. In France, Tahar Ben Jelloun pursued further studies in psychology and social psychiatry, began publishing articles in Le Monde, and began a career publishing novels, books of social commentary, pedagogical texts, and books of poetry that have been translated into over 40 languages. His best known, L'Enfant de Sable and La Nuit Sacrée, having been translated into 43 languages, and his brief pedagogical essay, Le racisme expliqué à ma fille, Racism Explained to My Daughter, of 1998, which was translated into 33 languages. He is, one of the websites I consulted tells me, l'écrivain francophone le plus traduit au monde, the most translated francophone writer in the world. He's also surely among the most recognized writers alive today. Ben Jelloun, awarded honorary degrees from the University of Montreal and from the Catholic University in Louvain, is a recipient most recently of the Argana International Poetry Prize, of the Croix de Grand Officier de la Légion d'Honneur in France in 2008, the Ulysses Prize in 2005, the 1994 Prix Maghreb, and the Prix Goncourt in 1987 for his work La Nuit Sacrée. In 2004, he was awarded the Impact Prize for Cette aveuglante absence de lumière, translated as This Blinding Absence of Light. I'm going to permit myself to read to you Impact's description of this work. An immediate and critically acclaimed bestseller in France, This Blinding Absence of Light is the latest work by Tahar Ben Jelloun, the first North African winner of the 1994 Prix Maghreb. Ben Jelloun crafts a horrific real-life narrative into fiction to tell the appalling story of the desert concentration camps in which King Hassan II of Morocco held his political enemies under the most harrowing conditions. Not until September 1991, under international pressure, was Hassan's regime forced to open these desert hellholes. A handful of survivors, living cadavers who had shrunk by over a foot in height, emerged from the 6 by 3 foot cells in which they had been held underground for decades. Working closely with one of the survivors, Ben Jelloun eschewed the traditional novel format and wrote the book in the simplest of language, reaching always for the most basic of words, the most correct descriptions. The result is a shocking novel that explores both the limitlessness of inhumanity and the impossible endurance of the human will. As you can see, Tahar Ben Jelloun's international recognition has come not from works that hewed to established orders or to apolitical themes, but from controversial texts, works that do indeed fight, many of them censored, reprinted, or translated piratically, excised, but circulated. Ben Jelloun's novels and essays se battent. They take on established ideologies, and they fight for those who cannot fight or whose weapons are weakest. Those like Maghrebi immigrants in Europe, in France, or in Italy, or in my country, Spain, who find there an often hypocritical, exploitative, racist pseudo-hospitality, secularists under fire from various fundamentalisms. Ben Jelloun's works fight against those who deliberately confuse Islam with some such fundamentalism. It's my hope that in our conversation this evening, the fight that I've been describing can be directed at the question of the relation between the cosmopolitan and the international, the cosmopolitan and translation, in ways that will, as I said before, be highly productive. And now I introduce Tahar Ben Jelloun.
Bonsoir, merci Jacques. On va essayer de traiter ce sujet.
So we will try to address this topic, which is strange and paradoxical, as you said. But before moving on, I would like to remind that the history of the Arab Muslim world had its centuries of light. It was between the 9th and the 12th century of the Christian era. It was the era when the duty of a head of state was to send researchers, intellectuals of his country in search of new manuscripts and to translate and to make them known in the Arab language. Translation was a sign of a great civilization. It meant to translate is to be civilized, to be curious in others, in order to leave an imprint on that civilization. And first of all, to consider that culture from whence we come is not a definitive one, is not complete, that it needs, in order to live and breathe, it needs other cultures. So the movement of translation, well, everything you said about imperfection and the impossibility of doing it, so it's a movement which tells us that there is something civilizing, that is still civilizing in society. To know what the other thinks or imagines, because we, of course, translate leaflets to know how to use a very technical piece of machinery, but we also translate poetry and novels. In other words, the imaginary fantasies of someone who comes from another society, from another tradition. And there, all that we are, all that makes our culture, whether it's Anglo-Saxon or Francophone or Arabophone, is made from an important segment of things we discovered not in an original language, but in a language that was mediatized, that went through translation. So everything that I know from the West, I know it through translation. And I realized one thing. Is that there are moments, times when the texts are so powerful, so complex, I'm talking about literary works, that the translation becomes impossible, and that the original language resists.
Il y a deux cas que
There are two cases against which I really butted heads. It was the Greek poet Cavafy. There were several translations of his work in French, and Marguerite Yourcenar did one. It's not the best. There were other attempts. He is a poet who resists the most to translation. And then there's the case of William Faulkner, whom you understand once you've read him in French, who I would not say translated, but reduced. You guess what lies behind as power of language. And then you realize that any translation is just a mere approach to this imaginary. And when I'm speaking of the Greek poet, it stands for all Greek poets. Paul Celan was translated by other poets. But we always stand in front of something unsatisfactory. We're always facing a lack, an absence which perturbs us, because poetry, in principle, is the celebration of language in what is most mysterious, most complex, most difficult, and consequentially, how can you go from that complexity to another complexity? Obviously, I've also done some translation. I've translated poets, Arab poets towards the French. And I think it's an experience that really made me suffer a lot, because I realized, for instance, to what extent the Arab language has a richness, a complexity, which French has a hard time keeping up with. I was only once a little translator, but I realized I worked with Mahmoud Darwish in order to do on this translation, another time with Adonis, but they were there. Mahmoud Darwish did not speak any French. Adonis does speak French and understands it. But with Mahmoud, it was much more complicated, because in his work there was one word that I would have to translate with 3 or 4 words, and that's when I realized that the passage is an obviously reductive passage. But that is the law, the lay of the land. You can't do anything about it. What's most amusing, twice I took part in Rotterdam. Once a year there's a big festival of international poetry, and every year we would have fun translating an untranslatable poem. Once it was a Lithuanian poem. I don't know the language at all, but it would be a Lithuanian poem translated by a Russian into Polish and then English and French, and it was sort of this Babel of translation taking place at Rotterdam. And at the end I was telling myself, oh, this poor poem, it's just, look at it, it just went here and there, and it's lost absolutely everything, and it's lost a lot of luggage during this journey. But that was just a fun attempt. Well, first I must say 2 words about cosmopolitanism. I never used that word. I used it before in a sort of provocative manner to say, oh, Tangiers is a cosmopolitan city. It appeals to tourists. But I would use another word. I would use interculturalism, and I would avoid the word multiracial. Interculturalism, interculturality, it means several cultures are invited into a same field. It's true that Alexandria during the 30s or 40s was a cosmopolitan town because it welcomed several intellectuals, poets, Greek poets, Egyptians, Lebanese. There was a whole mixture, a true cosmopolitanism. But multicultural society, I believe, is what is existing more and more a little bit everywhere. There is no monocultural society. That does not exist. You cannot imagine a society with only one single culture or language. And here it says I'm going into this notion of race, which I stand against, because human race does not exist. Human races do not exist, so that's why I will not use the word multiracial. But there are multi-ethnic groups. There are all different ethnic differences, psychological differences, mental differences. But there's no differences linked to race, because race has to do with vegetables and animals, but not with human beings. If only to the extent that each human being is his or her own race. So you could say that there are 7 or 8 billion races if you want to speak about races, but there's no white or black race or red or yellow or whatever. So this kind of technicolor label does not work with humans. So what we do have, however, are differences. There are mixtures. And these differences and these mixtures are the result of post-colonialism. Obviously, a society that was kept aside from the world, that would have been always white, always Catholic, never mingling with anyone, is impossible. It means it's something that stems from the virtual. It's sort of what Nazism had imagined and hoped for at a certain time. So it's something that runs counter to intelligence and to the human intelligence process. Human beings have a need to go towards the other. They can go towards the other to love him or kill him, but he goes towards the other. There's an exchange. And this exchange, as much as possible, has to be both the giving and taking. And you can receive affection as much as you can receive hate. But one is never indifferent. Societies are not created to close onto each other and to erect barriers and to say, here, we are just amongst ourselves, amongst whites, and no one else can come in. That is a political ideological decision. And there are people who adhere to it. There are people who believe that nowadays Europe is being invaded and it has to be cleaned up, be a big ethnic cleansing, and it has to be, and the borders then have to be shut down and people will stay amongst each other. So in France we were really surprised these recent times by a debate which in the end didn't happen, about national identity. At a certain time, the French President Sarkozy decided to name a minister for immigration and national identity. Immigration, national identity, what does that mean? Why is immigration linked to national identity? Does that mean a national identity is threatened? It means that there are immigrants who are good for French identity and others who aren't. And this notion of national identity was created on this confusion and a fear. And the fear, it stems from an ignorance and a sort of straying which is taking place everywhere in Europe, not only in France. We saw how in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Norway, in Sweden, in Austria, these countries are starting to lean more and more towards the extreme right. And this sort of tending towards the extreme right, the main theme of it is stemmed on the fear of seeing the European identity or the identity of each of these countries being contaminated or mingled or mixed by immigration. But in immigration, the real problem is Islam, because it's through phobia, the fear of Islam, that all these parties of the extreme right in all of these countries base their campaigns on. And that's how they frame the debate. So identity is what refuses multiplicity and difference. They want an identity with resemblance. So, but all human beings are different. There's no two identical human beings. But we all resemble each other. We may not resemble each other physically, but we resemble each other because we belong to a community, which means that we act, we speak, we try to communicate, and sometimes we translate what we want to say. So there is no pure race, there is no pure identity. So if we agree on this, translation is possible. But to translate, what is that? To translate is to try to unmask what is incomprehensible. You can indeed translate a written work, but you can also translate a behavior. You can translate gestures, you can translate silences, you can translate ways of being in the world and visions of the world, and there are behaviors in the world which remain incomprehensible when you go from one society to another. And this incomprehension sometimes needs a mediator to say, be careful, this person did such and such a gesture, you should do such and such a gesture in order for an encounter to take place. Then this sort of translation, meaning translating from the one to the other, it happens through language, through the linguistic language of words, or the language of gestures, or the language of gestures, of feelings, of the gaze, of the cinema, of theaters, etc. Everything is possible to translate to society. And nowadays, I think the most universal method, which has the most success, is music. You can go anywhere and you have young people who are listening to music that does not come from their society. There are some music that are more popular than others, but there is this real, let's say, universal translation through music, which is not the case with literature, because literature needs a bit more than a simple instrument, music instrument. It needs a music which may be difficult to express in words. And that is why we're so sorrowful, because this is a theme that comes back again and again, to see that the United States translates so little. Well, often it's always the French people who are complaining, saying, oh, like Americans are not translating French literature, but what they don't know is that Americans don't translate German, Italian, Arab literature or Asian literature. The United States only translates itself. In other words, and in order to be read in this country, you need to write in its language, and of course there are exceptions. Around 2 to 3% of books published in the United States are non-American books. To give you something to compare with, in France is the European country that translates the most. Along with Germany, we have 20% of the titles are translated works. 20%, that means... So first of all, there's a tradition. There's a tradition in Europe to translate. And we don't translate only good things, but the quantity is there. But this lack of curiosity, this shyness, or even this arrogance, means that we then pose the question of the interculturality. Here we are in a society which is the absolutely symbol of métissage. It's the most métissé, mingled society in the world. You can go in any state of the United States, and I've been in a few places. It is the society where immigration was a perpetual flux of bringing different ethnicities with different languages, with different traditions, with different musics, but at the same time,
une condescendance
a sort of condescension towards the language
c'est quelque chose qui est
in favor of the English language.
qui fait l'union.
It's normal, which is what creates the union of all these states. The unity is based on the language. And I'm not going to criticize the Americans for having a language that resembles, that links all these ethnicities, because I come from the Arab world where we have the reverse problem. In the collective imaginary of many people, the Arab world is lucky, well, there is an Arab people. Another meaning, there are 100, 120 million people, or maybe it's 200 million, I'm not quite sure. So all these people have a language in common, which is Arab, and that is not true. It's absolutely not true. What is common, what all these people have in common, is in classical Arab language, which the people do not speak. It's sort of like as if Latin, the role Latin had in 17th century Europe, but people communicate with each other only if they're very highly intellectualized. And in addition, you have this fantasy because there's this about this Arab menace, whereas in fact you don't have any linguistic or cultural unity. And any book published in Cairo will not be, you won't be able to find it in a Lebanese bookshop. A Lebanese book will never find its way into a store in Iraq or Algeria, etc. So I'm telling you about this. I'm taking advantage about this theme about translation to say that the culture of the Arab world finds itself in a moment of distress, but what is common is something completely elitist, which is the classical Arabic, which is a language of corn, which is magnificent, but no one speaks. It means when I am in Abu Dhabi or in Egypt, I speak classical Arabic in order to make myself understood, but the local peasant from Morocco, if he goes there, he's going to speak his dialectical language, and he will not be understood. So this notion, it would in fact be interesting to translate inter-Arab books. I think it would be nice to translate from Egyptian Arabic towards Moroccan Arabic. But that's another whole other story. Because it's behind this, there are a lot of ideological and political resistance, which make that the unity cannot be made around a democratic language, as it was the case with Greek or with Hebrew.
Le démocratisme en Grèce, qui fait que tout le monde se comprend, et on a allégé le grec classique pour pouvoir communiquer.
The Greek was simplified in order to enable everyone to understand each other. In the Arab world, people are unable to do this, first of all, because it's a language of the Quran, and you can't really transgress the language of the Quran, and also because intellectuals are continuing to write in that language. And we cannot say that they're reaching out to many people, because when you compare with Spanish writers, people who write in Castilian, whether it's from Peru or Mexico or Spain, there are these little variants in the language, but everyone understands, which means nowadays Spanish is just as important a language as English, because it was so cleaned up and unifying, and concerns like all of Latin America and Spain. So I'm going to speak a little, and then I'll let David say a few words. So in my way of writing, I'm often think about this issue of the Arab language.
de mes parents.
because it's a language of my
C'est la langue que
parents.
je parle,
It's a language that
je parlais à la
I
maison.
speak, that I spoke at
Et
home.
j'écris dans une autre langue. qui est
And
la
I am
langue
writing
française.
in another
Donc, je
language,
fais
which is the French
un
language.
travail de traduction
So
permanent.
I'm
Mais une
constantly
traduction,
doing this work of translation.
alors là, c'est compliqué parce que je
But
suis,
here it gets
je dirais, je suis
complicated
moins un écrivain qu'un
because
traducteur.
I'm
parce que
less
je
a
suis tout le temps en
writer
train de
than I am a
traduire
translator,
un
because I'm
imaginaire vers un
constantly
autre.
translating one
Et,
imaginary towards another.
Quand j'ai imaginé
And when I imagined
ce troubadour aveugle, je
this
pensais bien
blind
sûr à Borges,
troubadour, I was thinking about
qui
Borges,
gardait cette
Borges, who was,
bibliothèque immense alors qu'il était aveugle. Et j'ai pensé un peu, finalement,
and I
quelle est la langue,
to
la langue
myself,
qui va survivre
what
à
is the
l'humanité?
language that's going to
Quelle est la
survive
langue qui
humanity?
va
What is the language
unir les
that's
hommes
going
un
to
jour?
unite men
Je
one
pense que
day?
la seule langue qui
And
va
I
nous
think the
unir,
only
qui
language
va
that's really
peut-être
going to
faire
unite us,
que les hommes
that
vont
may
enfin devenir sages,
push men
c'est
to being wise,
la langue de l'art et de la poésie.
is the language of
Et,
art
et
and
la poésie n'est
poetry.
pas forcément dans les mots, elle est aussi
And poetry is
dans
not
les
necessarily
actes et la
in
façon d'être.
words, it's also in
C'est pour ça
acts
que
and in the way we
je
behave.
cite Borges,
So that's why I
poète,
will
qui
quote
était quelqu'un
Borges,
qui avait
who
une
was
telle
someone, the poet, who had such
curiosité de notre
curiosity
culture
towards other cultures,
il avait visité pas mal
that he had
de
visited a
manuscrits
lot of manuscripts,
arabes, bien
he
sûr,
read a lot
traduits
of
vers le latin,
Arabic manuscripts that had been translated into Latin, French, Spanish. He was
de réminiscences et de références
full of
de la
references
culture arabe.
about
Et
Arab
pour revenir
culture.
à mon cas,
But to go
il
back
m'arrive
to my
parfois quand
case,
j'écris
sometimes when I
d'avoir une
write,
sorte de panne,
I have this, I
pas
stall.
d'inspiration, mais
I
de
have
mots.
not a lack of inspiration, but a lack of words. The
Alors,
other
j'ai un peu
word
de
I
mots
was
en arabe
expressing myself,
qui est arrivé,
I have this
mais le mot
Arab
français
word that
résistait,
comes
ne
to me,
sortait
but
pas.
the French word is
Alors,
resist. It's not coming
Quand
out of
j'écrivais
me.
sur un ordinateur,
But so I was,
là,
since I was writing on the
je pouvais
computer,
pas
alas, I could
écrire. Alors
not.
j'ai écrit dans un bout de papier
So
le
I
mot en
scribbled
arabe,
on
comme
a
ça,
piece of paper
et après,
the
c'est
word in
revenu.
Arabic, and
Mais
then it came back to me.
avant, quand ça m'arrivait, quand
But
j'écrivais
before,
sur
when
le
it would
cahier,
happen to me and I was writing on
je continuais
paper,
la phrase en
I would
arabe,
just continue the sentence in
je mettais en
Arabic,
parenthèse, et après je revenais
and
dessus et je la
then,
retraduisais.
and then I would come
Mais
back to it and translate
cette
it.
coexistence
But this
de
coexistence
deux langues
between two languages
dans un même imaginaire
in a single imaginary
est parfois compliquée
is sometimes
et parfois,
complicated.
Elle provoque une tension
And sometimes it
qui
creates a
fait que
tension,
je pense que l'écriture
which
s'en
means that
ressent. C'est-à-dire
sometimes
que
you can feel it in
quand
the
on a une
writing.
écriture tendue, ça
When you
veut
have a
dire que
tense
il
writing,
y a eu un effort,
it means that there was an
l'effort,
effort,
quelque chose qui aboutit à quelque
And-
chose disons de préférable. à
and
la
effort
facilité
is usually
d'écriture.
something
Et,
that's
euh,
preferable to ease.
Et cette relation
But this relationship,
tendue avec
this
la
tense
langue
relationship
maternelle
with the
et puis la langue
maternal
d'adoption,
language
qui est
and
la
the
langue
adoptive
française,
language, which is
fait
French,
que moi ça m'amuse.
means that for me it's fun.
Et en même temps,
And
c'est
at the same
peut-être
time,
l'originalité de cette littérature.
It also maybe creates
Je
the
n'en nommerai jamais
originality
francophone parce que
of
c'est
this
un mot
literature, which I
horrible,
will
qui
never
va
name
dire.
francophone, which I think is a
Personne ne parle
horrible
francophone,
word because no one speaks francophone.
Mais disons
But
que
let
je
us
suis
say
dans une
that
position où,
I am
alors, on
in
me
this
dit, est-ce que vous êtes un
position where
écrivain
people say,
français,
oh, so are you a
arabe?
French
Bien sûr,
or
je
an
suis
Arabic
l'écrivain
writer? Yes, of
de la
course,
langue
I
dans
am
laquelle j'écris.
the writer of the
En
language in
français,
which I
en
write.
français.
If I write in
Le
French,
jour où
I am
je
a
dis
French
écrire
writer.
en chinois, je
And if
pense
I
que c'est
decide one day to
chinois.
write in Chinese, I will be
Demain,
a
mais
Chinese writer.
pour
It
vous
won't
dire un
happen
peu
tomorrow,
que
but
cette question d'identité, on revient
it
à la
reveals, I mean,
traduction,
it explains how
cette
this issue of
sont
identity,
souvent des questions de gendarmes.
these issues of
On veut
identity
savoir
are often
où
these
vous êtes.
interrogations. People want to know where you are. So are you French or Arabic? Are you Arabic or
Les
French? Are
gens
you
ont
Muslim
besoin
or etc.
de vous
People
mettre dans une case
need to label
ils ont
you,
peur des choses qui débordent.
and they're so afraid of things that don't fit the mold.
Or, un poète a dit que
A
la
poet
vérité
once
est
said,
quelque chose qui déborde.
Truth is something that
Toujours
spills
des
over.
bouts.
There are always
On va
bits and
couper la
pieces.
vérité
You
avec
can't cut
une
truth
espèce de métrage
with a
absolu.
sort
Et il y a
of
toujours
cookie
quelque
cutter.
chose qui nous échappe.
There's always
C'est ça
something
qui
that's
fait
going
que la
to escape from our
littérature
grasp,
existe, c'est ça qui
which
fait
is
la
why
poésie.
literature exists,
Parce que
which
nous
is
ne
why
maîtrisons
poetry
pas
exists,
tous les
because we
mystères
don't
de la création.
master all the mysteries of creation. So, thank you.
I'll have to stand up here just to have a couple of slides to show. In fact, I think my remarks follow quite nicely, as it turns out, on this very interesting comment by Tahar Ben Jelloun. And I will just start out from Jacques' evocation of Immanuel Kant and the hope of a kind of a cosmopolitanism that would lead to perpetual peace, and that famous formulation, I think it may be a newly interesting moment for that kind of return to this kind of cosmopolitan discourse after an extended period starting in the 19th century when cosmopolitanism had a hard time making its way against the high tide of nationalism as it was rising, with so many people being interested in creating a unity based on local language, particularities, values. When Kant says that it is language and it is religion that cause people to fight against each other, all these nations saying, yeah, we want one of those national languages. And we can have, let's say, Catholic culture in France, or state religion in England. And during the 19th century, cosmopolitanism was often regarded as suspiciously French, as a cover for the spread of French influence under the banner of universal culture, with French as the reigning language of diplomacy and the cultural capital of the 19th century. In the past several decades, I think cosmopolitanism has reemerged as a new possibility in our globalizing post-colonial world, but now it's often regarded as suspiciously American, a cover for American cultural imperialism, the Disneyfication of the globe, all too often for an outright political and economic imperialism as well, whereby, in a certain unhappy version of American cosmopolitanism, we Americans are the liberal humanist cosmopolitans, whereas they, formerly the Soviets, now the Islamists, goes back to the same question of the fear of mélange, how far is it a fear of Islam? They are the narrow, aggressive, anti-humanists wielding the weapons of language and religion that Kant discusses to trample on religious freedom, women's rights, promote indigenous opposition to global tolerance and harmony. But this whole debate gets very much foreshortened on all sides, and I think, as Tahar Ben Jelloun has just been saying, it is in literature that we get some resistance to the simplicity of these discourses. And Tahar Ben Jelloun's own work is especially intriguing, both because he is the most translated francophone writer, a term he has just rejected. He's the most translated almost Chinese writer, soon to be Chinese writer, but because his own work is deeply concerned with this problematic of cosmopolitanism within Algeria, within Morocco, within Tangiers, and abroad. His own works, in fact, exemplify the tensions of a cosmopolitan translation process as seen in America, the American cosmopolitanism of translation, and those rare 2% that Tahar Ben Jelloun was mentioning that get translated, of which his books must be a high percentage of the total 2%. We find very interesting sets of strategies. For example, in this this brilliant, haunting collection of poetry, La Remontée des Cendres, translated just this year as The Rising of the Ashes. We have an interesting bilinguality. We're talking about self-translation, or Ben Jelloun was just talking about self-translation. It is, in fact, a bilingual edition, the American edition, facing pages French and English, and is a bilingual edition in the original, but it's French and Arabic. So it's a quite different thing. So what happens in the cosmopolitan translation, the amour bilingue, this bilingual love, we lose the Arabic. And of course, it's a different book in the two versions because you have to read it differently. That is, it is a en face in English, whereas it is a disjunct book in the Franco-Arabic version. You have to read it from opposite directions. You read it one way or the other, each of which is integral to the way you would read an Arabic book or a French book. So it is a bifurcated book in a very real sense, with the Arabic translation by an exiled Iraqi poet, Kadim Jihad, and with stark pen and ink drawings of the faces of corpses by Azawi. This is these poems about the Palestinian conflict and about the First Gulf War. Originally published in 1991 in French. It was an American translator and publisher decided to translate it today, almost 2 decades later, obviously to intervene against the anti-Islamist discourse in the United States, but perhaps not without a certain subtext of warring cosmopolitanisms too. It's rather striking to find in the title, on the copyright page of the American edition published by City Lights Press in San Francisco, that the translation was funded jointly by the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs and by the Cultural Services of the French Embassy in the United States. An aptly dual effort of funding, in other words, both political and cultural, surely to push back, from French perspective, against American foreign policy and American cultural hegemony in the interest of French cultural diplomacy. And a project in which, in America, with French funding, the Arabic text disappears to be replaced by the original French as the second language for the now translated English. En face to face, if not precisely perhaps cheek to cheek. Tahar Ben Jelloun's work is especially appropriate to consider in these issues because he is such an extraordinarily complex cosmopolitan writer, not a simple cosmopolitanism by any means. And this is a recurrent theme in his book, in his various novels. Both cosmopolitanism as a necessary feature of the modern world and as a deeply fraught term, ineluctably in tension with the irresistible pull of the local, the hometown, the family roots, the submerged language, which he just described, translating as he speaks, as he writes, phrase by phrase into French. Even as these local languages, families, and hometowns, in a further turn of the screw, are shown in his fiction to be ineluctably always already cosmopolitan themselves. So it's not a simple opposition between the local and the cosmopolite at all. Here I'd like to touch on two of Ben Jelloun's most remarkable novels of recent years, and soon translated and published both by Penguin USA, Le Dernier Ami of 2004 and Partir of 2006. If we look for a moment at the translations of these novels, you see a number of ironies. Will immediately, of course, you have the American need for an image as opposed to the chaste purity of the French edition, which just the word, the title, the author, and so on. Here we have to have actually a place. We have the fact that the universal French edition, partir, generalize, where are we going from? We're simply leaving, becomes, of course, leaving Tangiers in English. We can't just leave anymore. Leaving becomes coming back to where we're leaving from in the American edition. The back covers are equally striking. There's a beautiful passage adapted from about a third of the way into the novel in the French edition with a haunting character, Malika, tragic minor character, talking with the lead character just about wanting to leave. So partir, so the key word comes where it wants to go anywhere. It doesn't matter where it'll go. Oh, any place, Spain, França, which is sort of ironic, is not actually France. It's the Portuguese town known for its bullfighting. So anywhere there, Spain, França, you know. She lives there in her dreams, she says, and well, our nights go, it depends on the nights. But so that's sort of odd, sort of bicultural Iberian one but two countries, which is but isn't La France at all. Whereas in the American edition, you see, instead of that, a little bio description, and then Le Point tells us that Tahar Ben Jelloun lifts the veil on an astounding world of 1,001 nights. Oh my God, did Said live and die in vain? Did he never write a word? We have the feminized Orient all over again in this recent, published with the best of intentions by Penguin USA, waddles its way here into print, lifting the veil of the 1,001 nights. Oh my God. Mon Dieu, I should say. One cannot control the blurb at all. But it's also interesting, so the French edition allows him Tahar Ben Jelloun to have his own words on the back. They don't give us Le Point, whereas Le Point is given to us here for the American edition, the cultural capital of the French publication, revealing to us, lifting the veil of the 1,001 nights. You can see equally with the American translation of The Last Friend, also published by Penguin USA just a couple of years ago. They just can't decide. I don't know whether the editors or the marketers simply have no clue how to present the book, or if it's a canny marketing strategy to hit all possible bases. So the first condition, again, each one tied to a French source. The first one is, again, this is the demystification part. what Ben Jelloun does brilliantly is write with a kind of refreshing candor that demystifies the Arab world. So we're demystifying. So it's about again lifting the veil, demystification, that mysterious exotic East. This is the way to understand that, right? Second, however, is about explains the human condition. So it's really not about Morocco or the Arab world. Actually, the Arab world. Interesting, right? We've just been speaking of the 20-some different countries. There is not an Arab world except to be demystified by the translation of Tahar Ben Jelloun's novel. But no, there's not even an Arab world. It is a human condition. Or on the other hand, French Book News says it's a seeming betrayal of a lifelong friendship. It's about the plot, right? So it's a buddy novel, or it is the human condition, or it is the mysteries of the Arab world. So as I say, I mean, it's either totally a really canny marketing strategy, multiple marketing, or it's total incoherence on the part of the publishers, of his own publisher. This is even before it gets out to book reviewers in the United States or us feckless academics who do whatever we're going to do with it after that. His own publisher, right, is presenting all these things. And at the same time, on the other hand, what's interesting, these are both really, really good translations. And one of the things I think is a benefit to Tahar Ben Jelloun is that he is writing in one global language, in this case being translated into another global language, in which for all that paucity of translations, there actually are a relatively lot of translations from French to English. There are a lot of people who are bilingual. I think it's much easier to get good translations from French to English than, say, Orhan Pamuk from Turkish. Tahar Ben Jelloun was saying that almost all of his translations around the world have been from French directly. Half of Orhan Pamuk's translations have been via English because not enough people know Turkish in enough parts of the world. So the more global language becomes a conduit. Already writing in a global language, you have already some insulation from that. Interesting to me that just to see in terms of cosmopolitanism and translation, these two novels, I'm just noting, take two very distinct views of how to represent the original in the translation. The one, the last friend, the dernier ami, does internal translation. So, for example, down here in the French, Dalida chante bambino, the singer is singing this song. For the English translation, we have to be told Dalida, the Franco-Egyptian singer, was singing bambino, right? And that's not laughable. It's an assumption that the French audience will know who Dalida is. The American audience will not know who Dalida is. So what are you going to do? Either you make the sentence incomprehensible to the American, or you quietly insert a phrase. And this, in fact, is exactly what Tahar Ben Jelloun himself does all the time with Arabic, and indeed even sometimes with Spanish. For example, in the phrase at the top, il a voyé assez facilement que ça faisait plaisir une fois par jour en se tapant une paille, traduction littérale de paja en espagnol. Pour dire masturbation. So he gives a Spanish word and then tells us for us, that is, translates into Spanish and tells us he's translating, right? As you see, beat a straw every day. He used the Spanish word for straw, paja, to mean masturbation, and joked about this with his friends. So he's already doing in the French for the Spanish what his American translator then does for anything that would not be clear to the American reader. It's the same thing. So it's actually totally integral to what Ben Jelloun is doing, carried forward to the new language. Now this is very discreet. This fits in with what Laurence Venuti calls the translator's invisibility. The translator's names are given on the title page, but you know nothing more about them. No information about them, no footnotes, no translatorial presence. Very different is a translation of Leaving Tangiers, published just in a couple of years by the same press, in which we learn about the translator. The translator gets a little paragraph next, just right below the author. He gets 8 lines, she gets 7 lines, only one line fewer about her prizes as a translator, her experience. She is a present figure. She then has a translator's note explaining why she has appended pages of notes, of actual endnotes to the book. So the very first line, in Tangiers, in the winter, the Café Haifa has an asterisk, which leads you to then the first of the notes. Tangiers is the main link between Europe and Africa, and the legendary Café Haifa perches on a rocky promontory with unbeatable view. We have almost... I don't know if Linda Coverdale is in the audience right now. She lives in New York, she lives in Brooklyn. Happily, she's not made the transition across the East River, but, well, it's a very good translation, but perhaps this is not the finest moment, this particular note. With its original decor seemingly unchanged since 1921, the cafe has fallen on harder times, but its terraces, later recolonized in stone 70s by rock stars, were long frequented by Le Beau Monde, interesting French phrase to appear, and writers such as Jane and Paul Bowles, Tennessee Williams, William Burroughs, who called Tangier interzone, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and Truman Capote, some of them helped make Tangier a well-known gay resort, which it remains, to a lesser degree, today. Now, the thing that's sort of odd about this, extremely elaborate, you haven't gotten past line 1 before you're directed to this, is that the scene that opens this chapter 1 is set in this cafe. There are no foreigners and there are no gays visible in the chapter. Not one. So this is a little bit dissonant until you find several chapters in that at another cafe called Whiskey A Go-Go, run by Germans, there is now a homosexual theme, gay theme introduced, and there are foreigners. Our hero gets picked up after being beaten up in the bar by Miguel Lopez, a visiting Barcelona art dealer who's cruising for young men. So the thing actually happens in the next bar a few chapters later rather than this bar. So there's a slightly odd thing in which, and I'd be interested to know what Tahar Ben Jelloun would think. Is this information that we should know if we were a French reader? I sort of think not. I sort of think this is going rather beyond and very clearly aimed towards the American market as predominantly American gay writers who are seen. Jean Genet appears in the middle of the novel as one of these figures, but not in the footnote, right? He's not signaled for us. So we have a kind of ethnographic cosmopolitanism here. Rather than the silent translator of the first and the invisible translator, here is the translator as ethnographer, as our guide, virtual travel guide to the unbeatable views and the unbeatable sexual history of the cafe, whether or not it's relevant to the chapter in question. More perhaps than a French reader would get. Particularly striking to me in this connection is that this plays on the complexities of cosmopolitan identity in Morocco itself as represented in these very novels. The Last Friend has stages of conflict between the primary narrator Ali and his best friend Mahmed, who later narrates in the book. Ali has moved from Fez to Tangier, and he's delighted to come to cosmopolitan Tangier as he thinks of it from provincial Fez. I realize, he says, I'd left behind an ancient era. After a single day's journey, I found myself in the 20th century, with dazzling lights, paved streets, and cars, a cosmopolitan society with several languages and currencies. So the word cosmopolite appears just 3 pages into the novel. Yet, in this twist of the terms, Fez itself is a more ancient cosmopolitanism, a refuge city for Jews expelled from Spain, a living museum, part of our universal heritage, we're told. Yet in the end, the friendship tragically falls apart, motivated in part by the friend Mehmed's suspicion of his friend from Fez. Because even after 500 years, anyone with a last name beginning in Ben, coincidentally, such as Ben Jelloun, is thought to be a converso, a Jew, still carrying Jewish characteristics of cleverness and calculatingness, perhaps not truly and fully Moroccan. As Mehmed declares to his friend, people from Fez make everybody mad. That's not racism, it's regionalism. A great line. So localism, or even discrepant cosmopolitanisms, both of which are shown to be there, Fez versus Tangier, breed tension even among enlightened young leftists who are reading Camus and Frantz Fanon in school. Leaving Tangier ups the ante on cosmopolitanism dramatically, juxtaposing the Café Haifa with the Whiskey A Go-Go bar later on, and having scenes in Spain, as much in Spain as in Morocco, where people flee only to be drawn back home, to be unable to leave. The cosmopolitan, to go to the ever more cosmopolitan, now Spain having opened up to become part of Europe, should be the perfection of this save move earlier from Fez to Tangier, but makes it all the harder. As one character remarks, Europe is pulling away. The country, Spain, is being pulled up into Europe by its new prosperity. The country is moving fast. Europe's pulling it north, away from us. Although we used to think we were close. I mean, that we were neighbors, only 8.5 miles, 8.5 little miles, 8.5 miserable miles between us. In truth, there are thousands of miles between them and us. Even when, having immigrated successfully to Spain, you'll always miss your country, one character says. We become so attached to Morocco, we can't forget it completely. It really sticks to us like an unseasoned frying pan. Great line. So I think that I'll just close here to open the discussion that Tahar Ben Jelloun's works are extraordinary explorations of the tensions of a cosmopolitanism that is ineluctable and that doesn't solve anything, that is in complete dialogue with the local, which is always already cosmopolitan, and which breeds the very conflicts that Kant hoped that cosmopolitanism would heal. The last friend closes with a vision. I think the closest thing I see in these novels to a vision of a truly working cosmopolitanism is recognized by the dying Mehmed, one of the two friends at the very end of The Last Friend, a kind of discrepant cosmopolitanism that he and his friend should have achieved but didn't in their lives. People thought, says Mehmed, we agreed on everything. In fact, what gave depth to our relationship was precisely the opposite. It was our different perspectives, our differences of opinion freely expressed, but without any kind of personal opposition between us. We complemented each other and defended the force that cemented our bond. With that utopian moment, with the death of the character, we'll come on to discussion.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you, Tahar Ben Jelloun. It seems to me that the two or three areas strike me as places where we might start asking questions and having a serious conversation about the different propositions before us. One of them would be the relation between localism or regionalism and the more general universal values of, say, literature or of community and so on. David mentioned the opening of Leaving Tangiers, that wonderful description of the café. The question was whether it had to be specified what this café was, what its history was for the consumption of an American market, but also for a further exoticization of it by means of this primarily Anglo-Saxon gay community that is then kind of seductively inserted into the novel at the very earliest point, where you would have this principle of consumption and exoticism calling out to us directly. Is it possible to be both local and universal? And where does translation work in that peculiar relation between the absolutely necessary desire to convey locality on one side, on the other side, the awareness of the global writer or the writer in a global market, that people who are reading it don't know about this café, don't know about these parts of Tangiers, except through a kind of exoticized and very false representation of a mysterious, veiled Tangiers that, that reeks of Orientalism in different ways. Is it possible to remain attentive to the local while at the same time aware of the much larger audience that one is speaking to? And how would you do this? I'm sure that this is something that you think about when you sit down to write, or perhaps not. You've solved it.
Non, je ne pense pas à ça.
No, I don't think about that.
Pour répondre à ta question sur le local et universel,
But to answer the question about the local and the universal,
je ne sais plus qui c'est, mais enfin, c'est quelqu'un
I can't remember who it was,
de connu, mais
but
il disait
someone
que
famous said,
il définissait le universel,
he defined the universal,
c'est le local moins les frontières.
it's local minus the borders.
Je pense que plus on est local,
I think the more we are
plus on est
local,
dans sa
the
vérité,
more we are in our own
dans
truth,
sa sincérité
in
absolue,
in
on a
our
des
absolute
chances de
sincerity, the
toucher le
more we have
maximum
the chance
de
to reach
personnes
out
en dehors de
towards
sa
the
culture.
maximum number of people who outside of our own
Ça n'existe
culture.
pas de faire
I don't
un
think
roman
it exists
généraliste.
to write a generalist novel,
C'est-à-dire un roman
meaning a novel
qui va parler de l'homme en
that's
général.
going to speak about
Ça
the
n'existe
human
pas.
being in general. It's not
littérature,
possible. It doesn't
c'est
exist.
l'individu,
Literature
c'est
is the individual.
D'ailleurs, c'est pour cela que
In fact, that is
la
why
littérature, enfin la culture arabe,
that is why
littérature
Arab
arabe
culture,
n'a
Arab
pas eu
literature
de tradition romanesque.
did not have any
Le roman est apparu
Romanesque
au
tradition.
XVIIIe siècle, en
novels appeared
1912,
in
en Égypte,
1812 in Egypt
par un monsieur qui s'appelait Mohamed
by
Haikal, qui était
a man named Mohamed
parti faire
Haikal,
des études
who
à Paris, qui avait
studied
lu
in Paris
Zola
and who read
et
Zola
Flaubert,
and
qui est
Flaubert
rentré.
and who came
Il a
back
écrit un livre qui s'appelle
and-
Zainab.
and he wrote a book called Zainab.
Et son roman n'était pas
And his novel
perçu comme un
was
roman,
not
mais comme un
conceived as a
feuilleton. Il
novel,
était
but
publié
as
d'abord
a
dans un
series.
journal en
It
feuilleton,
was first
parce
published
que le monde
as a
arabe
series in a newspaper, because the Arab world
ne reconnaît pas l'individu.
does not recognize the
L'individu
individual.
qui est l'essence même
The individual who is the
de la
very
littérature.
essence of
La littérature
literature.
est faite autour des individus,
Because
elle n'est pas
literature is created
faite autour
around
de l'homme en
individuals,
général.
it's not created around
Donc,
human beings in
comme dans la
general.
société arabe, l'individu n'existe
So
pas, il n'est
since
pas
in Arab
reconnu,
society the
c'est
individual does
quelqu'un
not
qui
exist, is not
est perçu
recognized, it's someone who is
comme un membre
conceived
d'un clan ou
as a
d'une
member of
famille
a
ou
clan
d'une
or of
tribu.
a family or a
Donc,
tribe.
le roman
So the
n'avait pas
novel
une nécessité
did not have a
d'exister.
necessity
C'est
to
pour ça que
exist.
le monde arabe a mis
That is
beaucoup
why
de
the
temps à y
Arab
arriver
world
et
took a while to
aujourd'hui encore,
reach the
on ne peut
novel.
pas dire que
And
l'individu a
nowadays we
émergé
still
dans
can't
ces
say
sociétés
that the individual has
et
emerged out of
que
these societies,
la notion
or
même
that the very notion
d'universel
of universal
paraît difficile à
seems
cerner
difficult to
parce
discern,
qu'il faut qu'elle passe par
but because it has to
un
go
personnage.
through
Et ce
one
personnage,
character, and this character,
j'aime bien en anglais on l'appelle caractère. C'est un caractère.
he's a
En français on
character.
dit autre chose, caractère.
I
Et
like the fact
tout à
that
l'heure,
it says in English that the
Jacques
word uses
parlait
character,
de-
because it is a character. And earlier, Jacques mentioned
David a fait remarquer sur les notes en
what
bas de
David
page,
was,
etc.
mentioning about the footnotes in the
Moi, personnellement,
translation.
ça m'embête, mais je n'ai
I have a
aucun
problem
mot à
with
dire
it,
là-dessus
but
parce que
I
je ne
can't
donne pas mon
really
avis.
have my say because no
Mais
one asks for my
quand par
advice on
exemple
this.
je
But for
lis
instance, when
un
I
livre qui est très
read a
très loin
book
de moi, très
which
étrange
is
à moi,
very far away from me,
qui est un
very
chef-d'œuvre
foreign to me, which is a
du Mexicain
masterpiece
Juan Rulfo, Pedro
by the
Páramo.
Mexican Juan Rulfo.
C'est un livre que je lis souvent parce que je l'aime beaucoup.
It's a
Eh
writer I
bien,
read a lot.
c'est un livre
Well,
où rien
one of
ne
his
m'est
books
connu.
is a book in which
Il parle d'un
nothing is
village
familiar to me. He is
qui est
talking
probablement
about
inventé.
a village which
Il
is
parle de
probably an
personnages
imagined
morts
one.
qui discutent,
He
qui
is
parlent.
talking about dead
Il parle
characters
d'un
who are
monde
talking.
totalement
He is
imaginaire.
stemming from a
Et c'est ça ce
completely
que j'aime dans la
imaginary world.
littérature.
And that's what I
Moi,
love
j'ai
in
pas besoin
literature. I don't need
qu'on me donne l'adresse du café dans
someone
lequel va
to
se
be
passer
given
telle
the
ou telle
address about the
histoire.
cafe where such and
J'ai pas
such
besoin non plus qu'on me
place
donne
is
le
going to
numéro de
happen in the
téléphone
story.
de
I don't need the phone
principale
number of the main
femme qui va trahir son
of
mari.
the main
C'est pas ça
female
qui est
character who's going to
intéressant.
betray her
Ce qui est
husband.
intéressant,
That's not
c'est
interesting. What's
c'est
interesting
de laisser le lecteur
is to let the
aller
reader go
vers
towards
la lecture
towards
la lecture n'est pas
the reading.
un journal
Go
télévisé,
towards
c'est pas
reading.
une
Reading is
information
not a
précise. La
TV
lecture,
series, is not a
c'est un don de
specific
soi.
information.
Lire,
Reading is a
c'est
gift of
une
yourself.
façon
To read is a
d'apporter
way
quelque chose à
of
l'autre.
bringing
Et
something
puis
to
l'autre
the
nous donne
other,
quelque chose. Et puis il y a un
and the
échange.
other brings something, and there's an
Le
exchange.
livre, quand il est bien, quand il
The
est fort,
book, when it's a good one, when it's powerful,
vous l'adoptez, il
you
entre dans votre
adopt it.
univers,
It
il
becomes
s'installe
part
chez
of your
vous,
universe. It sets
vous
its.
vivez avec, ce sont
You
des
live
personnages
with it.
Alors, les notes en bas de page,
So
moi,
the
ça
footnotes,
me barre.
so it really are a real drag to me.
Quick comment. I think I don't actually mind that there are notes in translations, and I think we have seen in various instances a kind of increase in people's willingness to accept that cultural information, which I think is not a bad strategy. I was a little bit making fun of this one because maybe it's a little bit over the top, right? The next note, telling you what a jalaba is and a kaftan is not a bad thing because there's a whole theme in the book about different kinds of clothing and weaving and culture sort of represent that, and I think you sort of need that information. Good example, speaking of the very distant work, the Tale of Genji has been translated several times over the last 100 years, and each time there are about twice as many footnotes as the last. The most recent one by Royal Tyler, which is a really good translation, has 50 pages of appendices telling all about colors and costumes and offices and all this kind of stuff. And if you took seriously the idea that the novel, you could never break the frame, then it would fail completely. But I think, in fact, there's a different kind of play that we have when we know we're reading about a book from a foreign world. In a way, it kind of de-exoticizes it if they tell us the stuff we need to know, rather than leaving it in this vague penumbra. And we can kind of play with the fact that we are reading a translation as well as a novel, just as we already play with the fact we're reading a novel and yet entering in a world even without the translation. In fact, this very book, Live in Tangiers, ends with a minor character named Flaubert, a character from Cameroon, hoping he can finally figure out what to do by emigrating into a novel, becoming a character in a novel. And so in fact, the frame is already broken at the very end. And I should say, Live in Tangiers is a masterpiece. It's a truly brilliant novel. If you haven't read it, you must read this book. It's just heartbreaking and in fact, incredibly timely and a lot of fun at the same time. So I think both those things can coexist perfectly well if they're done well. Though it takes a particular kind of sensibility to do it in a way that really enhances and doesn't kind of take the place of the novel.
I very much appreciated the description of translation and reading as giving to the other person and then receiving from the other person as well. This seems to me to be crucial in your novels, this, but also perhaps a more intelligent way of thinking about translation and about this, in the strong, interesting sense, what the world that we share is, a world in which by coming into contact with another person, you are giving up something of yourself in some way. And I was wondering whether you think this is a general condition of writing literature, that you find yourself giving something up to another that you don't know, that you write for another who is not there yet, whom you can't imagine. You're throwing it a little bit into the air and seeing this is the better part of me, and it goes out to you. I lose something by doing it, but I hope to get something back en revanche. And whether that, you think, is it's a disconcerting kind of gymnastic or almost acrobatic feat, where you're walking a very dangerous line of giving something up to someone you don't know, and as it were trusting that something will come back to you as a result of that. Is this what you would think of as a way of thinking about literature, translation? How does this work in the context of, well, I'll let you think about that.
Non, avant de répondre
Before
à ce que tu viens de dire,
answering what you
j'ai
just
trois
mentioned,
anecdotes
I have three anecdotes
sur la traduction.
about translation.
Une, c'était, elle est marrante, c'est pas le
One
mot,
was
mais disons
funny,
qu'elle est
well,
un
it's
peu,
not quite the right word, but let's say
comment dire, salée.
it's kind of has this twist to it.
Dans cette aveuglante absence de lumière, le livre sur les prisons,
So in the book
à un
about
certain moment,
the
je
jails, a
parle
blinding absence of light, at a certain
d'un
moment
pacha qui
I mentioned
s'appelait
a pasha
El Glaoui,
whose name was El
qui avait
Glaoui,
joué un rôle très important
who had
pendant
an important role
le protectorat français au
during the
Maroc,
French
qui était un pacha
protectorate in Morocco.
qui était
He was the pasha
qui travaillait, qui collaborait
who
avec
worked,
les
who
Français au
collaborated
Maroc
with the
et
French
toute la
in
région de
Morocco,
Marrakech,
in
il
the
jouait
whole area
un
of
rôle très
Marrakesh,
important
and he played a
dans
very
l'histoire du
important role
Maroc.
in Moroccan history.
Et bon, je parlais de lui
And
comme
so
ça dans le livre.
I talked about him.
Le livre a été
So the
traduit
book was translated
par un poète
by
libanais qui
a Lebanese
malheureusement est
poet
décédé
who has
maintenant
now unfortunately
et
died,
qui ne connaissait pas bien le Maroc
who didn't really know
et qui
Morocco
n'avait jamais
very well,
entendu
and who had
parler
never
de
heard
ce personnage
about
historique qui
this
s'appelle
historical
Glaoui.
character Gilawi.
Et il l'a traduit
And he translated,
au lieu de... Parce que le lettre G n'existe pas en
because the
arabe.
letter G does not exist in
C'est-à-dire qu'on
Arabic.
on met le G, ça devient un K avec
The G
trois points.
becomes a K with three
Le G
dots above
n'existe
it, while
pas.
the G does not exist.
Alors, il a traduit
So
avec
he
le Qaf.
translated with
Le Qaf, c'est-à-dire
Lurkav.
c'est
It means, I can't write it on the board,
une lettre comme ça.
but it's a
Et
letter
c'est
shaped
devenu
this way,
Glaoui.
and it became Klawi.
Or, en arabe marocain dialectal,
in-
il y a bien un monsieur
In
qui a écrit
dialectical
quelque chose tout seul.
Arabic,
Et Glaoui, ça veut dire les
Moroccan,
couilles.
it means the balls, the
Alors,
testicles.
j'ai eu la chance de
So,
pouvoir vérifier
I was lucky enough
la traduction.
to see the translation. I
pacha
said,
des
oh
couilles,
my
ça
God,
va
the
pas du
pasha
tout.
of balls, of
Alors, évidemment,
testicles,
j'ai-
that's no
j'ai pu
good.
rattraper les
So I was able to fix things in
La
time.
deuxième anecdote,
So
elle
the other
vient
anecdote,
de mon traducteur
It comes
suédois
from
qui
my
est
Swedish
quitté.
translator who unfortunately passed away as well.
J'ai tué mes traducteurs.
Seems like I've killed all my
Mais lui, je
translators.
trouve- Alors lui, c'était systématique. Il a traduit tous
So
mes
with him, it
livres.
was systematic.
Donc, on se
He
connaît depuis très
translated
longtemps
all
jusqu'à
my
sa mort.
books. We
Et
worked a
il y
long
avait
time together
toujours la
up
même
until his
chose.
death,
Il
and there was
m'appelle.
always the same thing. He
Toujours,
would call
il
me.
m'appelait. Il me dit,
He would call
dis-moi,
me, hey,
tu parles
can
de
you-
l'oncle de ton personnage.
He was
Mais c'est son
mentioning
oncle
a-
maternel ou
Are you
paternel?
mentioning the uncle of your character? Is it his paternal or his
moi,
maternal
je
uncle? I
oubliais.
was like, I don't
Il
know.
dit
I
non,
forgot.
parce que
No,
en
I need to
suédois,
know because in Swedish,
quand tu dis
when you
l'oncle
say
paternel,
the
c'est un
paternal
mot, l'oncle
uncle
paternel, c'est un
is
autre
one
mot.
word, and if it's a maternal
Je dois
uncle, it's another
choisir
word,
parce que
and I need to
À chaque
choose.
fois, alors j'invente. Il me dit, oui, mais
And I
dans
would
pas.
invent.
Enfin bref.
And then he would say, but in other parts, this and that. So this story was a recurring
J'avais pris
thing.
l'habitude à chaque fois que
So I was
quand je
used,
lui
I
envoyais
took
le livre,
the
je
use when I
dis
would send
attention,
him
il
in
s'agit
the
de
book.
l'oncle maternel et le papa paternel, etc.
I would say, be careful, this is a maternal
Enfin,
uncle and a paternal uncle
troisième
and so forth.
anecdote,
And a
elle
third
nous
anecdote,
vient du Japon.
it
Ça,
comes
c'est
from
marrant.
Japan. This is more
C'est
fun.
une japonaise
It's a
qui avait
Japanese
traduit,
woman who had translated,
je pense, La prière de l'absent, un
I
livre
think,
qui
The
se passe,
Prayer of Absence,
un livre, un roman
a
sur une
novel
traversée du Maroc
which takes
du nord au
place about
sud, par
a
trois
trip through
personnages un peu
Morocco
fêlés.
from the north to the south by three
Et
cookie
cette
characters.
traductrice avait
And this
obtenu une bourse
translator
pour venir
had
travailler au
gotten a
Maroc.
grant to
pour,
work in Morocco,
et elle avait repéré
and she had
les lieux, les quartiers et tout.
done a location
Et
scouting to find the
dans
neighborhoods,
mon
etc.
roman, moi
And
qui
in my
suis
novel,
Fès,
I was born
j'avais
in Fez. I
situé
had
une
situated
mosquée
a mosque
dans un quartier plutôt
in
que
a
dans un
certain
autre.
neighborhood rather than another. I had
Et
made a
la
mistake.
japonaise m'envoie,
And the
à
Japanese
l'époque, il y avait pas
translator
d'email, m'envoie une lettre, me dit,
sent me a
monsieur,
letter,
vous êtes trompé.
sir, you made a mistake.
Telle petite mosquée,
Such and such, the
personne
mosque
ne
was a
connaît.
minuscule
Elle n'est
mosque
pas
that
dans
no one
cette
knows,
rue,
is
mais
not
dans
in
l'autre
this
rue, en
street, but
face,
in the
etc.
other street,
Et elle a
etc.
rectifié, elle a
And
même
she corrected
publié à la
it,
fin
and
du
she even
livre un
published
plan
at
de
the end
la
of the book
ville de
a
Fès
floor plan of the
avec
city
les
of
rues et
Fez,
tout ça.
a street plan with all the streets, etc.
La
So
traduction,
all that
c'est
to
pas
say that translation,
une quatrième anecdote et on arrête
a
là.
fourth anecdote, and then
Un
that'll be it.
traducteur italien.
An Italian translator,
J'avais donné une date musulmane
I had given a
pour
Muslim date
une fête
for
et
a
je me suis trompé
certain
d'un
feast,
siècle.
and I made a mistake
alors,
out of
il avait
one
rectifié
century,
le
so
mot.
he had made a correction.
On est en 1400, etc. Pas 1300.
We're in
Donc,
1400, not
le
1300, as the book
traducteur, il a
says. So
un
the
rôle non
translator
seulement
has a role.
C'est une, comment dire, c'est une confiance. On lui donne ça, il faut.
So you trust him that he's going to transmit it without losing too many things, but at the same
C'est une
time,
confiance aveugle.
but it's a blind form of trust.
Je me souviens, Kundera,
I remember Kundera,
quand il est arrivé en France,
when he
en
arrived in France
1975, je crois,
in 1975, I believe,
il a appris le français
he knew a little French,
et il a relu,
And
il a lu ses premiers livres traduits
and he read his
en
first
français, comme La plaisanterie
the
et
first
Risible Amour.
translations of his works,
Il
like The
était
Joke and
furieux.
Laughable Loves, and he was
Il
furious.
a obligé Gallimard à
He forced
retraduire
Gallimard, the
ses
publisher,
livres
to retranslate the
par,
books
un autre
by
traducteur qui
another
connaissait mieux le
translator
tchèque et
who
travaillait
knew
avec.
Czech better,
Et ça, c'est
and he
là,
had
c'est
worked with
intéressant
before. And
de
that's
voir
what's interesting.
comment.
And it
Je
helps
pense
us
pas que
see.
le premier traducteur était mauvais.
I don't think the first translator was
Le premier
bad,
traducteur devait
but the first
certainement
translator probably
être plus allusif,
was more
et
elusive,
Kundera était plus précis dans
and
son
Kundera was more precise with what he
Le
wanted to
passage
do.
d'une langue à l'autre,
So the transition from
question de
one
confiance.
language to another is an issue of
et cette
trust,
confiance,
and this trust,
l'auteur ne peut rien.
the author can't do anything about it.
Il faut maîtriser tellement de langues pour y
You
arriver.
have to master so many languages in
Et
order
en fait,
to reach that
on va
point.
parler d'un autre phénomène. Je suis traduit en espéranto.
And then to mention another thing,
Alors,
I've
j'étais
been
très
translated in
impressionné parce
Esperanto,
que-
and I was really impressed.
J'ai dit, mais c'est un saut.
And I said, that's insane,
Quel
Esperanto.
pays,
What is that?
village,
It's a country, it's a
C'est
village.
qui ça, ces gens-là?
Who are
Enfin,
these
c'était très
people?
curieux.
It was really
Alors,
strange.
ils ont leur siège à
So
Rotterdam.
they have their
Ils sont
headquarters in
2000.
Rotterdam. There's 2,000 of
Ils
them.
font un tirage de 2000, tout le monde achète.
There's a publishing,
Donc,
they
problème
publish
résolu, il y a pas
2,000
de-
volumes and everything is bought. There's no residuals.
Perhaps we should pass to questions from the audience, if you would like to join us in the conversation. For David Damrosch or Tahar Ben Jelloun, I'm sure somebody has a question.
Thank you very much for that, Edward. I wanted to ask you, based on what you said in terms of how you think or do not think of languages as separate, how do you make the decision in which language to write a certain piece? And does that have anything to do with what you said about this sort of intangible character of language, which you expressed with words such as poésie, la musique, etc. There seems to be a certain spirituality, if I may use that word with a lot of liberty, to your approach to language. How does that affect your decision as to which language you write in?
Il faut le répéter.
Yes. I'm going to repeat so that the translator can, and so correct me if my repetition of your words is incorrect, please. So the question was, given that there is a fundamental relation or similarity between languages, how do you choose which of the languages that you want to write in? And in particular, is there a kind of spirituality that is expressed in the way that you were talking about it by la poésie, to the language that is specific to the language that you choose? Is that more or less it? I think that would be better.
Excusez mon français, ça fait longtemps que je n'ai pas vraiment parlé français. Il y avait une espèce une certaine spiritualité que j'ai ressentie d'après ce que vous avez dit à propos de la musique, de la poésie, de la langue. Est-ce que ça... Il y a ça, il y a encore le fait que vous avez dit qu'il n'y a pas de vraie séparation, de vraie limite entre les langues. Est-ce que intérieurement, quand vous faites la décision d'écrire soit en arabe soit en français, est-ce que ça fait partie de votre décision ou pas, et comment faites-vous cette décision?
Non, d'abord, j'écris que dans une seule langue.
First of all, I
Français,
write
mais
in
l'arabe
only
est
one
là.
language, French,
L'arabe,
but Arab is present.
il est en moi parce que
It's
ça
in
fait
me
partie de
because it's
mon être,
part
de
of
ma
me, part of my
constitution.
being, part of my constitution.
Chacun a sa langue.
Each of us has
La langue de la mère, c'est important.
his maternal language. It's
Mais,
important.
alors, ce qui se passe,
But
c'est
what
que
happens,
je pense que la langue
I
arabe
think the Arab
est
language
comme une irrigation.
is sort of like an
Elle irrigue
irrigation.
mon imaginaire
It irrigates
à mon insu.
my imaginary
Et
without my knowing
même
it.
si je ne suis pas un grand lecteur de la
Even
langue
if I'm not a
arabe,
big
ni
reader
un
of
grand connaisseur
the
de cette
Arab
langue,
language or very
elle
knowledgeable
est
about
là,
language, it's there.
elle m'apporte quelque
It
chose.
brings me something.
Sa musicalité,
Its musicality,
ses métaphores.
its metaphors.
Et puis ma mère qui ne savait
And
pas lire et
then
écrire
you have
avait
my
sa
mother who
propre
didn't know
langue,
how
avait
to
sa
read or write. She
propre
had her own language.
culture.
She had her own
Et ma
culture.
mère
And my
avait
mother
l'habitude de parler par métaphore
to speak with metaphors, to use metaphors,
avec une sorte de poésie.
with a sort of
Elle
poetry.
disait pas les
She
choses
would
très
say things
directement.
not
Elle faisait
very
toujours
directly.
des tours pour
She
dire
would
les choses.
always do a little
Et
detour to express things.
ça a dû certainement jouer
And that also
dans ma
probably had
façon
its
d'écrire.
role in my way
Et
of
j'ai appris
writing.
aussi que
And I also
la
learned
poésie,
that
dans une
poetry
langue,
in a
c'est comme
language,
les mathématiques.
it's like math,
C'est-à-dire
mathematics.
qu'on ne peut pas se permettre
Meaning you cannot allow yourself
d'écrire de la poésie
to write poetry
et de ne pas être rigoureux.
and to not be rigorous.
Parce que dans les mathématiques,
Because in mathematics,
si une formule lui manque un point,
if a formula, if it lacks a dot,
elle est fausse.
it's
La même
false,
chose
it's
pour la
wrong.
poésie.
The same goes for
Il faut que ce
poetry.
soit impeccable.
It has to be impeccable.
C'est de mettre le mot
The
là
word has to
où
be
ce mot
placed
doit être,
where that word
non
is
pas
supposed to be,
là où tout le monde le
and
met
not
forcément.
where everybody necessarily
Sinon, on tombe dans les
puts
clichés,
it,
mais là
because
où
then otherwise you fall into clichés,
le sentiment
but where the
qui vous
feeling
pousse à écrire
that is
met ce
pushing
mot.
you
Comme par
to write
exemple,
places that word.
Paul
For
Éluard,
instance, when
c'était
Paul
le-
Éluard,
le vers le plus connu,
one
dit,
of the most famous
la
writers,
terre est
said,
bleue comme une orange.
the earth is blue like
Évidemment.
an orange.
Personne ne parle
Of
comme ça.
course, no one speaks that way.
Mais pourquoi pas?
But why not?
Parce qu'il a mis le mot bleu devant
Because he
l'orange.
put blue
Et
in front of orange,
que la terre devient une orange.
and
Alors,
because the earth becomes an
évidemment,
orange,
c'est une
well, of
façon
course it's a way of
de prendre la liberté de tordre
taking
le cou
the
à tous les
liberty
clichés du
of bringing the
langage.
neck to all the
Et
clichés
la
of
relation
language.
de
And the
l'écriture,
relationship
c'est
in
justement
writing
une lutte,
is
alors
obviously
plutôt
a struggle, or
un
rather
combat sympathique
a
avec les
sympathetic
mots, et
combat
parfois c'est très
with
dur parce que
struggle
vous
with
avez
words. And
deux
sometimes
mots
it's
qui
very
arrivent
hard
pour la
because
même,
sometimes you have
pour la même
two
chose,
words that come
un
to you
mot
for
de
the
la langue
same thing.
maternelle et un
One
mot
in
de la
the
langue
maternal
acquise.
language, one in the acquired language.
Catherine.
Merci beaucoup. J'aimerais bien poser une question sur ce que vous avez dit sur la langue poétique. Parce que vous avez dit justement que la langue qui va rester, qui va survivre, c'est justement la langue poétique. Et justement, je pense que c'est une solution, une proposition bien métaphorique.
The interpreter will translate the summary made of the question from the
Parce
podium.
que justement, la langue poétique comprend toutes sortes de créations linguistiques en toutes les langues. Donc j'aimerais bien savoir pourquoi vous avez eu recours justement à cette métaphore de la langue poétique.
Would you like to say that in English? Because I know you speak English.
So, okay, I translate myself.
There you go.
Poetically.
Pardon?
Translate yourself poetically.
So my question is about the poetic language that you suggested as the language that will remain or that will survive. And I was wondering, because the poetic language is a metaphorical proposition that you made, because the poetic language is something that can be expressed in all different languages and that comprises all sorts of creations, linguistic creations and poetic creations. So I was wondering why you chose this specific metaphor.
Oui, parce que simplement on a pris l'habitude d'appeler poésie des vers qui se suivent. Or, la poésie, elle est partout, à condition de savoir la repérer. Je disais tout à l'heure qu'il y a la musique d'une langue. Vous pouvez par exemple être très ému en écoutant un poème récité par un grand poète arabe, même si vous ne comprenez pas l'arabe, ou un poète japonais, parce qu'il y a une musicalité qui va dire quelque chose à votre sensibilité. Et puis, il y a le fait que la poésie est une attitude dans la vie. Je peux vous dire ce qui n'est pas poétique. Beaucoup de choses ne sont pas poétiques. La politique n'est pas poétique. Vous comprenez? L'armée n'est pas politique. Tout ce qui veut limiter la liberté de l'individu est d'abord une action contre la poésie. Et c'est pour ça que, par exemple, un homme comme Antonin Artaud, qui s'exprimait de façon très originale et très difficile à accepter, a été mis dans un asile psychiatrique. Pourquoi? Parce que sa poésie dérangeait tellement. Et à la fin de sa vie, sa poésie, c'était ses cris. Il ne faisait que crier. Il criait sa souffrance. Et ça, c'est la poésie. C'est-à-dire que le poète n'est pas forcément celui qui va vous dire des belles choses. C'est quelqu'un qui va vous émouvoir parce qu'il a une attitude de dignité et qui rejoint cette recherche de la liberté de l'être, de la vérité de l'être. La poésie ne peut être que dans la vérité. Et c'est pour cela, c'est ce qui restera de toutes les cultures du monde. Pourquoi aujourd'hui encore les théâtres du monde entier jouent Shakespeare? Pourquoi? Pourtant, les thèmes de Shakespeare ont été réécrits après par tout le monde. Parce que Shakespeare a une langue et une attitude poétique qui est dépassée et la langue anglaise et les époques dans lesquelles c'était écrit. Shakespeare est peut-être avec Cervantes, les deux plus grands créateurs de la langue universelle. Vous lisez Cervantes en castillan ou traduit dans n'importe quelle langue, vous avez des montagnes de poésie. Vous lisez Shakespeare, c'est la même chose. On peut ajouter quelques autres grands de l'histoire. Mais la véritable spiritualité, elle est dans la poésie et la poésie est dans la vérité. On ne peut pas, un poète truqueur, imposteur, ça ne va pas, ça ne marchera jamais. Ça se voit tout de suite. Tout de suite, on le repère, c'est un viol de la poésie. Et il y en a beaucoup, malheureusement, d'usurpateurs et de violeurs de la poésie qui passent pour être des écrivains et des poètes. Mais ça, le temps fait son choix avec le temps, justement. Emily.
Question for David, which is about the position of professional critic and mediator translation. It seems to me that you identified something very complicated, which is that sitting as you are in a position as a both professor of literature and as a go-between or mediator, that you're on the one hand in favor, as I am too, of translating the maximum and of seeing this, especially non-Western literature, or literature in French that's marketed as francophone, whatever. And it tends to be, it seems to me you pointed out a pitfall, which is that anything called francophone gets hyper-translated more than, say, hexagonal literature or even French written in another Eastern European context. But on the one hand, you have to be, in a sense, some kind of lobbyist for translation. And on the other, there's this extreme discomfort with hyper-translation, which does strange things to texts, which over-explains, which takes away the untranslatable. So, I mean, I think what you're identifying is something actually quite tricky, which is the double hat phenomenon. On the one hand, we're, as Tahar Ben Jelloun said, we're in a culture that translates only 2% of literature, if that. But at the same time, there's a sort of ethic to criticizing hyper-translation. It was done much more in the case of African, Franco-African literature, perhaps than in your case, where glossaries are added. I just have some thoughts.
I think that both as translators and in a way also it's the same issue for anyone teaching a class, because you're deciding what translation to use and how are you presenting it, right? That there's the, particularly for translation, it's necessary to both intervene in a market and try to push against the market values. That's, I think, the trick. Right now, I've just accepted a proposal from the Modern Language Association Translation Series that I would translate a Francophone novel, a so-called Francophone novel, by a Congolese writer, Will or Georges Ngale, called Jumpati Civico. It's the one I've written about, Le viol du discours africain, which was never translated before, from 1975. Now, and there's a case in which it seemed as though it was satirizing all the major political positions of the time, so it did not make Congolese nationalists happy, it did not work internationally, and now I think it's the moment for it. So, I mean, as a mediator, we're thinking, okay, it is a moment for it, both because maybe now people can read it intelligently and because it can serve a constructive purpose in our culture now to read it. So it's not just confirming something, but it extends what we know. And I think both at the level of how you translate it and what you choose to translate, right? It's a matter of always se battre to really sort of press forward. And I think that the sort of passive market-driven translation is not really worth doing. But at the same time, I mean, this hyper-translation, you know, it is an ethical as well as a linguistic thing at one and the same time. I get nervous if I think the translator is just taking over too much, right? But also the sort of shy, retiring translator who is completely invisible and does their work silently is not necessarily more honest. So I think we have to find a way between that, which means, among other things, that we in comparative literature now have to teach translation theory, a subject that was never taught when we were in school because we weren't supposed to use translations.
I think we have time probably for one more question, if there is such a question.
I have a comment for Professor Damrosch. As an anthropologist, I'd just like to say what you're talking about is what people have been doing in ethnography for quite a long time. And there are different techniques in which, in the beginning, you try to define something in a pan-human way, or at least certain terms that you're going to use. But then it's absolutely indispensable to use footnotes, because if you're talking about an exotic society in the Amazon practicing endocannibalism, people are not going to be familiar with all of this. So it requires a balancing act, I think. The problem is that you're so vulnerable to distortion and misinterpretation And I'd like to know, how do you protect yourself against that? Because just as you're surrendering, when you're writing a poem or novel, you're surrendering something very valuable and personal, and you wish to, in the case of the ethnographer, respect the society that you're describing. But at the same time, there are people out there who will vocally sometimes misinterpret this or change it for political purposes. So I hope you
Also, do you want to summarize the question and then so that Tahar can hear as well?
Yeah, there is always the problem of a translator of literature today has a lot in common with problems that anthropologists have dealt with for a very long time. That you need footnotes, you need to give culture-specific knowledge, otherwise people simply are missing too much of what you say. But you also have the danger of being misinterpreted, reused, being kind of re-exoticized. And I think, the back cover of this novel is to show how very difficult it is. It's almost, the market pressure is very, very, very strong. So I think we have to press hard against that in the way we frame it. And a certain kind of, it needs a kind of delicacy or tact. I think that the translator can get into a kind of will to power over the text. So I think we have to guard against it in ourselves first. And then we have to frame it in such a way to try to get the reader to approach our work in the same kind of tact that we have tried to use towards the text. And you just have to do your best to try to do that.
Moi, j'aimerais revenir sur cette pression du marché.
I would like to come back on this issue of the market
Quand même,
pressures,
central.
which is quite a
Parce
central
que,
one.
Bon, évidemment, les éditeurs
Because the publishers
font un travail commercial
are
tout
doing
à
a
fait
commercial type of work.
légitime, normal.
Completely
on va pas discuter
legitimate,
de ça.
normal, we're not going to
Mais
address
ce n'est
this.
pas un travail commercial comme n'importe
But it's
lequel
not
des
just any
travaux.
commercial type of
C'est-
work.
Ils ne vendent pas
They are not
des
selling
machines, ils vendent
machines,
de l'imaginaire, ils
they're
vendent de la
selling the
littérature.
imaginary, they're selling
Alors,
literature.
il se trouve que
It so happens,
pourquoi
why
ils ne prennent pas des risques
don't they take risks?
d'aller
Why don't
au-delà de ce
they
que le
take the
marché
risk
attend?
of going
Parce que le
beyond what
marché,
the
on peut
market
le
is
créer.
expecting? Because you can create
C'est-à-dire
the
que
market.
je me souviens dans les années
I remember
70,
during the 70s,
juste après le prix Nobel
just
de
after
Gabriel Garcia
Gabriel
Marquez,
Garcia Marquez's
il y a
Nobel
eu
Prize,
un rush
there was a
sur les
rush
écrivains latino-américains qui ont été
towards
traduits en
Latin
masse
American writers who were translated in
France,
mass
et par
in
conséquent
French,
en Italie, en Allemagne,
and by
etc.
consequently in
Il y a
Italy,
une
Germany,
espèce
etc. There
d'intérêt
was
et ça nous a permis,
this
moi
sort
ça m'a
of
permis
interest,
personnellement,
and it allowed me
de
personally to
découvrir
discover,
très grands écrivains.
great
Sans
writers,
cet éclairage
without this
qui a
lighting,
lancé
this spotlight that
sur
was
cette
put
littérature,
on this
je me sens,
literature,
j'aurais perdu beaucoup.
I would
Je
have
me
lost
sentirais
a
aujourd'hui
lot.
beaucoup plus pauvre.
I would really feel
je
much
suis sûr
poorer, less
que le
rich
public
today, and
américain,
I'm really
anglo-saxon
convinced
en
that
tout cas,
the
est
American,
privé
the
de très
Anglo-Saxon
grande
public is being
littérature
deprived
qu'il ne
of
connaît
great
pas.
literature
Et
that it
est-ce
does
que-
not know.
Est-ce que l'université,
And I think,
les intellectuels,
could the university,
peuvent faire
could
quelque
the
chose pour ça?
academics do
C'est-à-dire,
something about
évidemment
this?
qu'il faut
Of
pas que
course,
l'éditeur perde de
The
l'argent.
publisher
C'est
should
normal.
not lose money, it's
on est d'accord
normal, we all
là-dessus.
agree
Et
on
est-ce qu'en
that.
même temps,
But
on peut accepter que des États
But is it possible
participent
to
à ce genre de
accept
choses? Parce
that
qu'un
states
État, il a ses
take
intérêts.
part in these
Donc,
things because the state has its
la
own
question que je
interests?
pose, je n'ai pas de réponse.
So the
Comment
question I'm posing, I
arriver à
don't have
ce
the answer, is
que
how do we reach the point
Ce pays qui est un grand pays,
for this
et
country, which is a
puisse
big country,
à avoir ce virus qui
be
est la
able to have
curiosité.
this virus of curiosity?
Je dis la curiosité parce que
I'm saying curiosity.
je fais une extrapolation un
I'm
peu
doing an
rapide.
extrapolation, a
Mais
rather quick one,
On sait que
but we know
les Américains
we know that Americans
ne vont jamais gagner la guerre de l'Afghanistan
will never win the
parce qu'ils ne
Afghan
comprennent
war
rien
because they don't understand
au
anything
Pakistan et à l'Afghanistan.
about Pakistan
Et
and
pourquoi ils ne
Afghanistan.
comprennent rien? Parce
And
que
why
ils
don't
n'ont
they
jamais rien
understand?
lu
Because they've never
de
read
l'imaginaire de
anything
ces
about the
pays-là.
imaginary of
C'est
these
pas
two
qu'en ayant
countries.
lu un livre un jour
It's not
d'un
because
Afghan,
you read
on
one
va
day,
comprendre
one book one day by an
la
Afghan
guerre.
writer that you're
Mais
going to
je pense
understand how
que
to conduct war, but I
l'ignorance
believe that the
à la
ignorance,
base
which resides at the
ne peut
base,
pas aider
cannot
même
help
une entreprise pour la
even
démocratie.
an
pour la
enterprise for democracy, for
On a
freedom,
besoin
etc.
de connaître l'autre.
You
Et de
need to
connaître,
know,
c'est
to
savoir,
understand the other,
savoir
and
ce-
to know is
ce
to
qu'il
understand, to
pense
understand
dans
what
ses
he
fantasmes,
thinks,
dans ses
what
rêves,
his
dans ses
fantasies and
moments
his
les plus
dreams,
secrets.
in his most
Et ça,
secret
c'est la
moments,
littérature qui nous
and
le
that's
donne.
what literature gives us.
Tous les agents d'information et de
All the
renseignement,
information
ils vont vous dire,
agents,
oui, il y a
they're
un
going to
musulman
say,
qui
yes,
se cache
there's a
là-bas.
Muslim who is
Ils
hiding
vont pas vous
here,
donner,
but they're not going to
ils vont
tell
pas vous
you.
donner ce qu'il y a dans le secret,
They're
dans le
not going to
cœur
give
des
you what
hommes et
lies
des
in the
femmes de ce
secret in the
peuple-là.
hearts
Parce
of the
que
men and the women of these people.
c'est par la création
Because it's
littéraire,
through
c'est par
literary
l'art
creation,
qu'on
through
connaît un
art,
pays et un
that you
peuple.
know
C'est
a
pas par les
country and its
informations
people. It's not through
politiques et
political
policières.
information and police
I
information.
think that's probably the best place we could stop. Bon, allez-y.
Je voudrais poser une question qui paraîtra peut-être un peu plus personnelle à Monsieur Tangiers. Quand vous écrivez un roman, une poésie, vous imitez votre âme, votre sensibilité, tout sort des bords de votre peau, je suppose, parce que c'est très dur d'écrire, on le sait. Les auteurs écrivent, on demande à être souvent seul, écrire la nuit, écrire dans des conditions particulières, pour pouvoir sentir vraiment ce qu'ils vont écrire. Et quand on en arrive à la traduction de vos livres en telle langue, est-ce que vous ne vous sentez pas véritablement trahi?
Le mot trahi,
The word
non, on peut, mais que faire?
betray,
Que faire?
what can you do?
Parfois, il m'arrive de recevoir des traductions, je ne sais même pas quelle
Sometimes I
langue c'est.
receive translations, I don't even know what
Je-
language it
bon.
is. Well,
Je confonds le coréen, le chinois
whatever,
et
I
le
confuse
japonais.
Korean,
Bon,
Chinese,
vous pouvez
Japanese.
m'excuser, je ne connais pas toutes ces langues.
Forgive me, I don't
Mais-
know any of these languages,
Mais
but
après tout, vous dites,
but after
question de
all,
confiance. Peut-être
it's
qu'un
an issue
jour,
of trust.
quelqu'un va
Maybe
me
one
dire,
day
tu sais, tu es
someone
très
will
mal
tell me,
traduit
you
en
know, you're
coréen. Et
really
alors?
badly translated in Korean. And so what? What am I going to do about it?
Mais
But-
comme je suis arabe,
But since
je
I'm
pense que vous
Arab,
êtes
I think you
Non?
are as well. No?
d'accord.
Oh,
Ben,
you're
ouais,
close
ça va, alors
second.
on est très,
Everything's
très
okay.
proches.
We're very close to each other.
Moi, j'ai un problème avec la langue arabe
I
parce
have an
que je
issue with
suis
the Arab
piraté
language
dans un
because
pays
I'm
qui respecte ni les droits de l'homme,
pirated
ni
in a
de
country
l'auteur qui est
that
la
does not
Syrie.
respect
Ils piratent
human
mes
rights
livres, ils les traduisent très
or
mal.
authors' rights, which
Ça,
is
j'ai pu vérifier
Syria.
parce que j'ai
They
arabe.
translate very
Et
well,
ils
and I was
censurent
able to
aussi.
double check.
Et ça, c'est
And they also
plus,
censor.
beaucoup plus
And that
meurtriant.
is much more
Ça me meurtrit beaucoup plus que de
mortifying.
savoir que je ne sais pas ce qui a été écrit en coréen. Vous comprenez?
To know this
Parce que je
than
lis
to
l'arabe
not know
et
what's
nous
happening in
avons
Korean
en
because
face
I understand
un
Arabic,
État
I
qui
read
ne respecte
Arabic.
rien, qui n'a
And
jamais
we're
signé
facing
les
with
conventions de
a
Genève
state
sur
that's
les droits
never
de l'homme.
respected
Alors,
anything
un
that's
jour, je
never
commençais à
signed the
crier
Geneva
dans une
Conventions.
émission.
And one
Et
thing
quelqu'un
in
m'a
the
dit,
show,
mais ils ne
someone has
respectent pas les
started
droits
to
de
holler
l'homme.
about
Pourquoi
this.
veux-tu qu'ils respectent le droit de l'écrivain?
It's like
C'est
they don't
comme ça,
respect
c'est un
human
État
rights. How do you
policier, une
expect them to
dictature qui est
respect
comme ça.
the writer's rights?
Et il se trouve que on peut rien.
And it so
La Chine
happens
aussi
that
fait
we
la même
can't
chose.
do anything. China
Bon,
does
mais ça,
the
c'est la
same.
Chine, elle est beaucoup
But
plus puissante que la Syrie.
China is much more powerful than Syria.
And this time, I think, would you please join us in thanking our discussants and then for a glass of refreshment in the basement?